I'm Adam Gelb. I have been in this field for a long time, and last 12 years at Pew, and I just stepped away about a month ago to start a new criminal justice organization, a new national organization that will be a part invitational membership organization, part think tank, trying to lift up the individuals and the field at large. So just a quick word about your moderator today. It's my honor to help steer this discussion. And when I think about it, I think about this issue of risk assessment. I think about pendulum swings and paradoxes. I can't remember in the 30 plus years that I've been working in this field an issue I felt like has taken such a swing so fast. And I just think it's fascinating and probably one of the most important conversations happening at this conference and one of the most important conversations in the field right now. I want to, as just quickly by way of setup, say that some of my first introductions to this field back in the late 80s were around these type of questions, which were really centered on how do you guide discretion in the criminal justice system. You have all these decision makers making all these decisions about people's lives. How are you going to strike the right balance between having wide open front doors and back doors and being too prescriptive? And one of those first things that happened was in the late 80s with the establishment of the federal sentencing guidelines, which is, as you recall, was part of a search that was started by a federal judge to say, it's chaos in the federal courts around the country. It doesn't matter, your sentence really turns more on where you did it, what jurisdiction you're in, than it does on what you happened because of the different sentencing practices there. So that gave rise to the federal sentencing guidelines. At the same time, at this point I was a reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I was on the police beat, and there was a guy, Sergeant Arcangeli, who had a pin map in some back room in the police department. And he was the high-tech guy, because he would take the police reports and he would stick little pins in this map. Sometime about a week later, when the reports made its way to him, and he would put yellow for the robberies and red for the homicides. And this was highfalutin crime analysis that everybody was looking toward to say, oh my goodness, where should we deploy our officers based on where crime is happening as opposed to the random patrol. So you flash forward and you've had this tremendous increase in research about what drives criminal behavior, and on so many different levels that's informing now decision making at all phases of the system, from policing through pretrial, through sentencing, probation, and parole release. And a long period there where there was a real sort of yearning, even craving in the field for this kind of information. Give us data, give us something on which we can base our decisions and be confident that we're steering people into the right places. And a big part of that, I think, was a search for transparency and consistency and fairness. We want to treat people, similarly situated people, in similar ways, and we want to have some criteria that are out there that we can rely on across courtrooms and across others. And in the last few years has been, as you all well know, a real legitimate pushback on some of this, to say the information you are basing some of these things on, maybe this was all done with good intentions, but some of this information is tainted and carries bias of decisions that have been made in the system before, whether it's been by police or by judges or parole boards. And by using these tools and relying so heavily on some of this information over the past, you are exacerbating some of the biases in the system. So, for those of us who've been in the field for a long time, the pendulum has shifted dramatically in this conversation in the last few years, and you have what I think are also these paradoxes around original intent of transparency and consistency and fairness now being interpreted as, hey, this isn't fair and or consistent. So with that, I want to introduce our panel. If we did a risk assessment on the panel, we would have a very high-risk panel. This is a dangerous group of people. They are all at high risk of upending the status quo. So it's an exciting group. And I want to start. Okay, I should have sat you in order. First is Hannah Sassman. She's a Soros Justice Fellow who's working with communities most impacted by mass incarceration, specifically on this issue of risk assessments or predictive algorithms. Next is Barry Friedman, who is super high risk on the scale here today because he is a professor both of law and politics, dangerous combination. And his project is dedicated to strengthening policing through ordinary democratic processes, drafting best practices and policies for policing agencies, including on technology and surveillance and other issues. Next is David Kennedy, one of my idols in the field, the pioneer of some of the most effective violence prevention initiatives around the country. As you all know, he is the head of the National Network for Safe Communities here at John Jay. And then finally, Joanne Wallace is president and CEO of the National Legal Aid and Defender Association and has worked in this field also for a long time, including on the juvenile, starting out on the juvenile side. So what we're going to do, I'm going to tick off 5 or 6 questions here just to kind of give everybody a roadmap of what the panel will cover today, and then we're going to take them one in turn here. So we're going to first talk about what each of their work involves with risk assessment, how their work intersects with risk assessments, and sort of do a little stage setting there. Then we're going to ask for their views of what are the key advantages and improvements of risk assessments and risk and needs assessments over prior practice. Then we're going to ask what are their key concerns and disadvantages, then the area most in need of improvement. Then we're going to talk about what safeguards should be put in place and by whom. And then finally end up with, if we don't get there earlier, which we certainly may do, but the key question of compared to what? If not risk assessments, then what? How are we going to responsibly guide decision makers throughout the different phases of the justice system? All right, so enough for me. Let's kick in on that first question, and let's just go around the table here. And Hannah, if you could just talk about how your work intersects with the issue of risk assessment.
Can people hear me okay? Well, can people hear me now with less insane feedback? Okay, so thank you very much, Adam. I'm really excited to be here and to be learning from all of you. My name is Hannah Sassman. I've been a community organizer in Philadelphia for my entire adult life, primarily focusing at the intersection of technology and racial and economic justice. So I used to build radio stations with community groups. I used to fight Comcast. I miss fighting Comcast. It's very clear everyone hates Comcast. Much easier to fight. And so the work that I'm doing is specifically working really deeply with communities both in Philadelphia, which has had a big push towards decarceration over the past few years, but as well as around the country when tools like risk assessments are introduced as something that are sold as absolutely necessary in order to do something like end money bail and push towards decarceration. So we've been engaging with these tools both in the pretrial context as well as in the sentencing context. We were able to stop the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania from instituting a risk assessment as part of sentencing and are now engaging with the Commonwealth for what they're going to do next because there's a statutory requirement to have a risk assessment tool for sentencing, but as well as talking to people who've been judged by the child welfare system, people who've been judged by mortgage, by banks, and where risk assessments have said that they weren't worthy of the same consideration that every single person might want in our society. So I'm not really sure exactly what else to say, but there's a little bit of an introduction. Like, we work for communities to specifically have power over technologies that judge them. So.
Thanks, Hannah. I'm Barry Friedman, and I'm the director of the Policing Project at NYU School of Law. And what we do actually follows directly from what Hannah just said, which is that we focus on what we call front-end accountability around policing. So when you hear about problems in policing, whether it's use of force or stop and frisk or name it, there's a lot of focus on after the fact accountability, which means that people think about criminal prosecutions and civil rights suits or 14141 actions from DOJ or civilian review boards. And we're aimed very much at being concerned about regulating policing on the front end with sound policy, but most importantly with community voice, democratizing policing. Our goal is democratic policing, and to do that we focus on a lot of things like gathering information through cost-benefit analysis so the public understands what are the benefits or costs of various policing models. And one of our big jobs is writing model policies for policing, and we have been working on policing policies around policing all summer long, in fact, including on predictive policing, which I'm going to talk about, and the goal is to try to find policies that limit the harms that Adam alluded to and to try to get whatever benefits we can out of the new technology. So I'm going to talk some about that.
So my engagement with predictive stuff, I think has one kind of large resonant component, which is they make me unbelievably, incredibly nervous, and I don't like them, and so that keeps me up at night. More specifically, and I can talk more about that as we will, more specifically, the National Network is first and foremost a violence prevention shop. And in that domain, our focus has largely been on keeping at least any existing modalities that we've seen so far as far away from our business as we can possibly get them. So there are basically two ways that predictive tools have been used in at least core urban violence prevention. One's focused on spaces, so that's what a lot of predictive policing has been. It's been about saying, based on what we know right now, this area is at high risk. And I don't like that stuff. I'm less concerned about that than I am about other things, because usually the response to that is a relatively marginal increase in presence. And that's not a great thing in and of itself, but it's not necessarily going to lead to quite predictable harms. It's interesting that those tools are being used primarily to direct presence, because that's not the only way an insight like that could be used. We know that the better kind of hotspot policing involves problem solving and community engagement, and that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing presence, but it could be otherwise. The other way prediction's being used is about people. And so far, there is no way, and I don't see any prospect of prediction being used about people in any useful way. So serious violence is, thankfully, statistically an extremely rare event. And our capacity to predict extremely rare events in the realm of human behavior is essentially zero. We're missing that in this world because almost all of the tools being used for prediction are not, in fact, predicting bad behavior. They are predicting vulnerability and risk. Andy Papachristos, who's the social network theoretician who's driven a lot of this work, have this conversation going, which is that there should be a Papachristos SNA drinking game, which would be every time Andy's work is talked about in the press and the beginning of the article says, brilliant professor has discovered way to model risk by social network. At the moment in that article, when the article stops talking about risk and starts talking about dangerousness and predation, which they always do, you take a shot. And everybody would be tipsy, because all of these accounts begin with the fact of the matter, which is the device is looking at risk and vulnerability, and becomes dangerousness. And were we to use those tools to predict and act on risk, that would be something else. You know, the Chicago heat list, which I despise, I guess I'm going to be saying that a lot, is built on risk assessment, we think. And if the result of that were to say, these following folks in Chicago's high-risk neighborhoods are at high risk of getting killed and hurt, and we undertook safety planning for them, that would be one thing. But what happens invariably is that it gets used to direct surveillance and enforcement and deployment of state power and all that kind of thing. And they're no good for that, and we shouldn't be using them that way, and our our capacity to have insight into the future with these devices is vanishingly small. So let me leave it at that.
Good afternoon. The National Legal Aid and Defender Association was actually created to scale access to justice, and we've been doing that by working to create, expand, and improve access to counsel systems for more than 100 years. We do that focused on both the public defense and civil legal aid delivery systems through education, innovation, and advocacy. One of our core focus, one of our main priorities is to support the leaders of those systems to be transformational, so on the public defense side, transformational co-leaders of the criminal justice system, and to provide them with, training or tools, other resources to help them do that. We have been lately very focused on the pretrial space for a number of reasons, including the significant impact that what happens there, including whether you're held or not, has on you for the whole life of a case or the time that you're in the criminal justice system. So sort of cost-benefit analysis, where you put your resources. And in that regard, we've been very fortunate to be one of the strategic allies of the MacArthur Foundation, working specifically with the defender community as who are on those teams, as well as throughout the country, to try to both educate and support their ability to grapple with these very complex issues. And of course, you cannot have that conversation and talk about these issues at this time without having the topic of risk assessments come up. We currently have a task force, one of our sections, the Council of Chief Defenders from across the country, a task force on pretrial justice, and they're looking at both risk assessments as well as other issues like community engagement, and trying to find a path forward to help defenders across the country, some of whom are in jurisdictions like New York, or DC, where they have incredible resources, pretrial services agencies, all sorts of research resources. At the same time, helping chiefs from other jurisdictions, in a rural county that has very little, if any of those things, try to figure out, what to do about risk assessments and how to navigate and be leaders in helping to transform their pretrial justice system so that it is both fair and effective.
Thank you, Joanne. Let's stay on this for just a quick second. I'm going to guess that most people in this room are on the sort of the post-arrest side of things and focus on pretrial sentencing corrections. Is that correct? Can I see just a quick show of hands? How many people are sort of on the policing end of things here? That's what I suspected. So I'd love for Barry, maybe we just go back and talk, because of that, I'm suspecting that people are more familiar generally with what risk and assessment and risk assessment is in that part of the system. But can you talk a little bit more about predictive policing and exactly what it is?
Sure. So, and I want to be clear, because Adam's going to roll the questions out, and it's not till later in the conversation that we get to what freaks us out about this and what to do about it, that I stay awake at night along with David, and I'm sure others up here, and have some thoughts about what to do about it. But let's learn what it is first. So David's right. There's basically two kinds of predictive policing. One tries to predict or forecast where crime or violence will happen, and the other tries to forecast either who will commit crimes or violence or who will be affected by crime and violence. And in many places, those might be similar folks. And so there's place-based and person-based. And it's all based on a set of data that's put into some kind of algorithm that makes those predictions and replaces this idea of cops on dots, which is that the police departments used to just stick pins in the map and then send cops to those places. So, there's a good and a bad story to tell there, and I'm going to allude to the bad story and then try to tell a good story. So, if there are certain areas of any jurisdiction that have crime, then perhaps there's something that we would want to do about that. If there's violence in a particular place, we'd want to do something about it. And so knowing what those places are is a good thing. The problem is that there's lots of bad things that happen when you go to those places. And so, David said, one of the interventions is presence, which is that if we identify one of these hot spots, we send cops. If we actually just sent cops and they just stood around, and I sometimes wonder what it would be like if, because we work in jurisdictions where the police departments will say, you know, the deterrent is blue lights. And I think, well, what if you just turned on the blue lights then and didn't do anything else? Like, what would happen? But that isn't what happens. It's enforcement that follows, and often enforcement for low-level crimes, drug offenses, misdemeanors, and that has deleterious effects. And then if that enforcement pattern is being fed back into the algorithm, then you're just going to perpetuate the biases, particularly racial biases that come from that, and that's something to be worried about. One way to think positively, and I just want to say it, is to separate out what you might think of as the intervention, or what political scientists would call or social scientists would call the treatment, which is once you have a place that you're concerned about, what do you then do? And we shouldn't just talk about the police, we should talk about government entities altogether. So there have been a lot of studies of hotspot policing, which is the idea of focusing on where most of the crime is. Those studies tend to show that by focusing in that way, there's a positive effect on crime, but it often doesn't look at the costs, and we have to think about the costs. But you could have other interventions. So, you know, Anthony Braga and some co-authors, for example, showed that one of the most effective things you can do in hotspots, if you're doing broken windows policing, is actually fix broken windows, which is to say, take down abandoned houses, worry about litter, worry about lighting, worry about broken windows. And so there are, in a dreamy, happy world, which I want to be clear that I'm not in that world, and I don't think any of us are, and we should worry about the world that we're in. But in a dreamy, happy world, we could do some prediction if we can get accuracy that way, which is its own problem, and do some positive things. But the question is, what do you do? What's the intervention?
Great, thank you. So you were leading into the next question, which we can move to here, which is, and I've asked you all in advance to come up with one. Force yourselves, really make yourself come up with one thing that's better about the use of a risk assessment or a predictive tool than prior practice. Hannah.
Do you want me to start, or is that okay? Yeah. So just first to respond really quickly to Barry, I think that one of the things that we think about here that's missing sometimes from the conversation is power, right? It's when there's police with dots and there's data scientists compiling all of those dots, where does the community actually get to the ability to say, you got the wrong ass dots, y'all. Like, these are not the right dots. And I'm thinking specifically about Pittsburgh, for example. Carnegie Mellon is in the process of building a predictive policing tool. Right now, in partnership with the mayor, and I'm working directly with community organizers who are saying what the people in the community that's being focused on by this tool want is more lighting. They want more lighting so that way they can actually watch themselves, police themselves, provide a level of safety. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunities, Barry was touching on this, where we can take the idea of risk and really think of it instead as a need. And even better, think of it as a need as determined and shaped by ourselves, by our people. But just to directly answer the question, I do focus mostly in the bail space, and I know that Joanne and others are focusing heavily there too. And I'm going to paraphrase Alec Karen-Stakis, who wrote an email about this a little bit earlier today, like that the stakes in risk assessment are a lot lower if only a small number of people who are arrested for an act of harm or a supposed act of harm, an alleged act of harm, are even eligible for detention. So if we're using risk assessment to say that only the tiniest number of people, that extraordinarily very small percentage of people, as David was pointing to, who have potentially committed an act of grievous harm, who really cannot in any other way be kept safe themselves and keep others safe and not, and make sure that they're back in court unless they are locked in jail. That very small number, if we are using it to say that everybody else gets to go home with their needs minimally met, then it's good. Then it's a good thing, or at least it's a better thing. But what we're seeing instead, and we'll get into this, is that there's a lot of jurisdictions, especially those that don't have the resources to have a fully blown public, like pretrial safety or pretrial services administration or another administration. We're seeing a lot of institutions using tools of this nature for efficiency. They have science stamped at the top. They're called objective, they're called race neutral. And when we have an institution that's using forecasts based on the data collected from thousands of other people, and that data is collected in a process of criminal justice that is at its very root and core deeply racist and biased in its practice, and we don't have the capacity to watch it, then we should have some extraordinary concern.
Well, I'm actually going to pass the mic, I think, because I've already said enough. I just want to highlight something Hannah said because I love it, which is, and David actually said something very similar, which is if we thought of it as identifying needs, then we could think of what the interventions were that met those needs. And the risk is that when we think of it as crime and violence, we just have one answer, which is we send in force and the law.
So Barry's answered this question one way, which I admire, which is to say, if things were different, things would be different. And that's right, I agree with that. So I'm going to stay in the things aren't different. And the question was, or the charge was, find one way in which things are better. I can't.
So I will stay with that charge, and I think the way I answer that is there's a yes, but. Okay, so what is attractive, or what attracted, I think, folks in our community to the idea of risk assessment, two things. Number one, we're talking generally about evidence-based approaches and using data, and usually or often that is good for our clients. I mean, there's good research and evidence about what works in terms of to help people improve their situations, not keeping them incarcerated too long, and so this whole evidence-based approach, you have to be interested in it to see where it goes. Also, of course, we are very focused on implicit bias and what that means, and so when you talk and how it can impact discretion. So if there's some opportunity to do something to ameliorate that, then that sounds very attractive. And then finally, I would say initial studies or reports that suggested that use of assessments actually ended up with more people, and I'm talking in the pretrial space right now, being released that wouldn't have been, according to initial research, otherwise released if the risk assessments hadn't been used. All that sounds really good. However, and then, here comes the but, we're also seeing now the backsliding of some of those early initial reports on release rates. We don't, and there are a lot of other factors that we don't know, like what are all of the things that are contributing to those lower rates, and so you really have to unpeel and unpack that onion a bit more, and I guess we're going to get to that. But, final word is, from our perspective, you have to look seriously at anything that can result in more people not being deprived of their liberty. And so, we are always looking at the data and these numbers, but we always have to remember that every single one, even if it's only 10%, every single person that makes up that 10% is an individual with a home and perhaps in a family and a life, and it matters. So we have to look at these very seriously to see how we can improve things.
Barry, did you want to come back or no?
I just want to say one thing that's moves a little bit. I don't disagree with David. I'm just going to say it in a different way. David says he can't find one thing that he thinks is good.
In the violence.
Yeah, I'll even generalize it, but I'll happily start there, which is even worse is that we don't know. So one thing I do proselytize about is the unbelievable failure to apply cost-benefit analysis in the criminal justice system the way we do in the rest of society. And so you might think that there was something good in something I said earlier, which is that there are studies of hotspot policing that show that we can intervene and actually drive crime and violence down in certain geographic locations. That sounds good. If you're only looking at one thing identified as a benefit and then stopping. But if you're not looking at all of the supposed benefits and more importantly the costs and most importantly the social costs of policing, you have an incomplete picture. And so what David knows and others in the room know is that I stand on a soapbox because until we start actually looking at the full range of costs and benefits of our interventions, actually we're just in a state of ignorance, and that's not a very healthy place to be.
Thanks. So let's shift. Obviously, we've gotten aired a number of concerns already, but let's shift affirmatively to that. And I want to prompt you a little bit more, because I'm hearing a theme here about both concerns about the information itself and then how the information is used. And so I want to ask if you could just, as you're answering this sort of next set of questions here around what are the key concerns here, can you distinguish those two things?
Sure. So I can talk a little bit about this again in the pretrial space. And if we're glossing over things that folks don't understand, like, please jump in, because I think that one of the biggest issues with when we talk about algorithms and decision making is that it seems obscure. It seems easy to trust because it says science on it. And the more we understand it and the more transparency it will be better. So in terms of what these tools say, the vast majority of pretrial risk assessment tools use data points that are collected from criminal justice, right? And so the tool I'll use for an example, the tool that we were fighting in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. In 2010, the Commonwealth passed a law saying you have to have a risk assessment tool included at sentencing. And the risk assessment tool should answer the question of whether or not someone will recidivate, and I'll talk about how they define that, in 3 years when released. The tool that they ended up cooking at first used arrests as a proxy for dangerousness, right? So that meant in a city like Philadelphia, in a county like Allegheny, how many times had a black or brown person been stopped by the police? A behavior of theirs criminalized when it wouldn't have been if I had done it, for example. Eventually, after some public engagement, they changed that to convictions. But we also know that in a system, when bail is one of the biggest things that's keeping people in jail, or a violation of probation or parole, taking the guilty plea is going to get you home, going to make sure you keep your job, going to make sure that you stay with your family. Over 90% of guilty convictions are pled. So we're then using that data point to immediately and permanently call someone risky. The tool on its face was so bad at predicting violence, it was only 18% effective, right? That it redefined risk of recidivism down away from violence, even though that was what was prescribed by the statute, to a violation of probation or parole, so not showing up to see your officer, not paying a court fee, all the way up to a new arrest. And it also, and I think this is really the kicker, it considered black people 11% more dangerous, or 11% more criminal on their face than white people, base criminality. So we were only able to see these things because there was something of a transparent process associated with the Commonwealth's Sentencing Commission, so we could challenge them. So we both had problems with, here's the other piece. These tools were meant to only prescribe a post-sentencing investigation, meaning the judge would actually ask you a little bit more about yourself, investigate your family, your supports. It would only prescribe that investigation for the lowest risk people, the lowest quarter, and the highest risk. So everyone in the middle wouldn't get that investigation and would just have the judge making their decision. This was people were so angry about this that everyone from, the Bar Association to many people impacted by mass incarceration, to Color of Change, to the ACLU, I believe, and a variety of other groups fought it and were able to stop it, not just because of what the tool said, but because what it was going to do. It was going to take away the right of an individualized sentencing to happen. And we have very similar concerns for pretrial. And they really focus on the fact that the cost of losing one's pretrial liberty is so grave. So, I've been arrested before, right? I was in jail for 26 hours. I got to go home on my own recognizance. I didn't have children at the time. If I had a job where they didn't let me have a day off, if I didn't have someone to watch my children, I could have lost my home, I could have lost my children, all of that, right? So in a pretrial context, what we need is the right to have an individualized argument. We need to be able to say, this is who I am. I need an attorney next to me with the ability to present evidence. And if a risk assessment tool is clearing out the vast majority of cases and sending the vast majority of people home, so people who have the chance of losing their liberty get to have that argument, then I see the purpose of it. But we're seeing a bunch of laws, and in a bunch of other communities, that's not necessarily happening. And I'd love to dig deeper into that with all of you.
Joanne, stay on this kind of risk assessment, and then.
Sure. Okay, so I think I'll pick up where Hannah left off, which is a major concern is how the tools are being used as a panacea and a substitute for, cutting corners in ways that are not only not helpful but affirmatively harmful. So, the risk assessment tool, like any data, helps us ask new and better questions, or at least it should. It should be data is one part of, is one piece of information or one resource to consider when making any decision. But the risk assessment was becoming, the answer to pretrial detention or unnecessarily high pretrial detention in a way that it was never meant to. So pretrial systems and those that work effectively, so for example, where I am in the District of Columbia, in 2016 they released a 90% release rate. And yes, they have an assessment tool, but that is just one part of a multifaceted plan to support data-based decision-making around risk and need, and which includes access to counsel, which includes well-resourced and trained pretrial services agency, which includes having procedural due process, a preventive detention scheme that includes a right to a hearing, clear and convincing evidence, and many other safeguards. So it's one thing to think about risk assessment as part of a kind of panoply of resources, but it's how it's used and in the framework of what is the context in terms of the other pieces of the system that go with it.
Joanna, can I stay with you for a second here? Are you concerned about the conflation of risk and needs here? And Hannah, you mentioned this a little bit before, but in this conversation that has really kicked up in the past few years, do you worry about the baby being thrown out with the bathwater here, in the sense of people not making enough of a distinction between looking at the needs and assessments that need to be done to look at dynamic risk factors such as substance abuse versus the risk factors of prior criminal history, for age at first arrest, and those other pieces? How do you see that conversation evolving? And
Absolutely. In fact, there's a lot of conflation when it comes to risk assessments in so many different areas, and quite frankly, that's part of the issue and part of the concern. Is, someone was talking earlier on the topic of race, that we have to know our history, that we all have to be starting from the same point in terms of knowledge in order to have context. Well, the same thing is true with this topic, because it is very complicated, and whenever you're having a conversation about risk, there are so many different places and levels of knowledge that people start at. So there needs to be some base knowledge so that we're not throwing around terms without using them completely. We talk about risk of what? We use these shorthand terms, but in fact, there's risk of flight, risk of not coming to court, risk of, killing somebody. There's a range, and we should be specific about our terms. And yes, and to your question about conflation, on risk and need, absolutely. So there was a case study done on the Pretrial Services Agency in DC around the 50-year mark of its anniversary. And I was really struck by something that Jay Carver, who was then the head of the agency, said about how things evolved, how they got rid of money bail, or the use of it in the District of Columbia. He said that we had to focus on what happened when we released people first. We had basically saying they had to focus on individual need before dealing with the detention side of things. And that's what really propelled getting rid of the use of money in the District of Columbia. They had to do things like figure out what helps people to be successful in coming to court. Figure out things dealing with the issue of substance abuse, mental health, and those services. So they had to really focus on, the need side of the equation before getting and dealing with the risk side of the equation. And that's what really drove the reform process in the district.
Thanks. David, your thoughts on that?
So this is a perfect setup for what is my highest level concern about this, which is that in practice, so not necessarily because there are counterexamples, but in practice, risk assessments, I think, bring with them a kind of natural framing, which is something along the lines of the job at hand is to manage our current activities and portfolio somewhat differently. And yes, we're going to say that we're doing too much of X, too much money bail, too much time, too much supervision. And so we should dial that back. But that is another way of saying we're doing fundamentally the right stuff, and we need to titrate. We're at a place in criminal justice where we should, I think, not only not begin with that framing, but we should very actively, consciously oppose it. And American criminal justice has become so overreaching, the criminal law has become so overreaching, our application of state power has become so overreaching, our activation of our deployment of sanctions and carceral placements so dramatically overreaching that I think we should begin our engagement with the presumption that things are fundamentally wrong and how can we do things fundamentally differently. And this idea that there's a technical device that can get that right for us imports the notion that things aren't nearly as wrong as we should assume that they are. And I love the Washington, D.C. example, because that says to me that if there are places that have done away with money bail and they are making that work, why are we having the risk assessment conversation? Right? If we know that there are ways of keeping huge numbers of people from being arrested, and there are lots of examples of those, why are we not beginning our engagement with notions about managing jail and defendants and pretrial with a commitment to not doing as much of that as is humanly possible in the first place? And just to go back to where I started, those things are not totally incommensurable. So one could have a massive re-envisioning initiative in which risk assessments have a place, but that's not what's going on. What's going on is these are coming to be seen as the way of solving the problem, and that is bringing with it as a given things that we should be committed to undoing and as actively questioning as we can manage.
I just want to respond to that really briefly. I think that this is a really engaging conversation. Folks in a coalition that I'm a part of called the No 215 Jail Coalition in Philadelphia, which has been engaging in criminal justice and really the movement to end mass incarceration for some years now, brought a number of folks from Philadelphia City Council and some other folks in the Philadelphia sort of criminal justice infrastructure to DC to observe, some bail arraignments, to talk to the administrators in pretrial. And what they saw there was that the folks going to court in Washington, as compared to the folks who go to the Criminal Justice Center in the city of Philadelphia, the folks going to court in Washington, they were way less burdened and way less concerned, because for the vast majority of them, they knew that they were going home. They knew they were going home that day. So I think that David is really right. The risk assessment is there, but it's there on top of a definitional culture that is about bringing people back into their communities to get the resources they need to face their case. That is not the case in the vast majority of jurisdictions in the United States, including ones that are instituting and enshrining risk assessment. I think California, with the recent passage of Senate Bill 10, is a very strong example of that. They've enshrined risk assessment. They've ended money bail, or they will be ending money bail in the state of California, but they've also given judges a huge list of cases, a huge list of charges for which they can just not release people, an expanded one. And the way that they're going to be using risk assessment is that if you get a red flag, if you get one of those high risk scores, the presumption is that you are not going home. A rebuttable presumption is that you are staying in that jail cell. That's the concern. The concern is that without communities defining what risk truly means, risk of what, without our ability to actually change the conversation from something that just says end money bail, full stop, to end money bail and pretrial incarceration. And I heard someone from a bail fund, I was training 40 bail funds around risk assessment, thinking about it last Monday in Chicago, and a woman from Massachusetts said, what we really want to do is end pretrial punishment. Because this isn't the time for punishment, right? This is the time to have your day in court and to fight for your freedom based on the Constitution of the United States.
So we got about another 15 minutes before we shift to questions, and we have two big questions to get to here. So let's do a fairly quick round on this next question, which is, given these concerns, what safeguards should be in place? David, you might just say, wipe it all out, so we can save a few minutes on your response.
Let's move on.
Yes. So if others want to say, there's a lot of this out there at the various stages, and maybe there are some places where you can unring the bell if you wanted to. That said, is this a matter for police to do themselves? Is this a matter for the courts to do themselves? Is this a matter for legislatures to step in, or somebody to step in and put some parameters on what information is used to make what decisions?
I can go quickly.
Yep.
So I just want to, there's a couple folks here who helped work on this with me, including Vincent Sutherland from the Center for Race and Equality and the Law at NYU, Sakira Cook, who's a senior counsel at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, Logan Kepke from Upturn back there. I'm just going to show it to you here because we can't really do slides in this bright room, but if you go to civilrights.org and you look for pretrial, we put together a shared statement of civil rights concerns on the use of risk assessment in a pretrial context, and it starts with what David is saying, which is just don't use these. If you don't have them, just let people go. But if you do use them, there's a variety of both statistical as well as community oversight and transparency processes that you can put in place to prove that they're being used to dial down the racism that's inherent in our system, and to prove that they're decarceral, and to put communities and public officials in a place of power over how these tools are laid out, and I'm happy to talk more about those principles with you. But there's just one thing I do want to say is that there is a point where every algorithm should be tested for its accuracy and its impact, called validation. And even if you have a tool that's been in play for years, like here in New York and in Washington and in many states and cities around the country, revalidating that tool with new community definitions, with new community members at the seat of defining what risk might mean and testing for bias in those results, that's the very least you can do.
So I want to just sort of go back to the technical aspect of how risk assessment works to walk forward to what to do about it. So, in the beginning there was an algorithm, and it's a formula that predicts when something's going to happen. It's actually slightly more complicated than that, because sometimes there's an algorithm, which is that somebody's figured out that there are factors that we might want to look at. And sometimes in the machine learning world, we just actually give the computer the job of saying, how often can you get positive hits, however you define them, and the computer figures out its own algorithm, and you talk to technologists who will say it's a black box even to us. We're not exactly sure what's going on inside the computer, but you've got some device that's going to predict. And it needs data. So you have to get the data from somewhere. Now we can all say, well, we're worried about perpetuating discrimination in society, be it racial or religious or country of origin, and so we can't let that be in the data. Fine. But now I want you to just sort of think about two different kinds of data, one real and one imaginary, but I want you to imagine it. So let's say that, drugs are what worry you. So one thing you could do is you could collect data on where people are arrested for drug offenses, and you could put those dots in your map. The other is you could have a magic machine that could survey the jurisdiction and show you where drugs are possessed all over the place. And I bet you that those two maps look totally different. That one of them is biased in certain ways because that's where the cops keep coming back to, and the other reflects what society looks like. So we've got to worry about kind of the built-in biases to the system. And then I want to point out, you actually could have a system that looked at a different set of data altogether. So you could look, instead of at where cops went, you could look at calls for service. Where did the call, and notice the word service, where the call from the community for help came from, and how often did that call come? Are we getting that same call 14 times from the same house about domestic violence or about mental illness or whatever it is? And then, just to go back to the conversation everybody else was having, we could tailor interventions that were aimed at the problem that's actually happening. So, what do we do about this? The first thing we think at the Policing Project pretty profoundly is you shouldn't be doing any of it unless you've got a written policy that's got some democratic pedigree behind it that was fully transparent. And full transparency includes no algorithm that somebody says, well, this is a proprietary product, and so we've bought it off the shelf from a vendor, but it's a trade secret and we can't let you know. There are people, even in this world that David doesn't want to have happening, who are at least making their algorithms fully transparent so people can look at what's happening. So the first thing is complete transparency about data sources and algorithms. The second is policies that are in place that the community has a voice in, so they actually get a say in what's being used in the community. And then lots of complicated questions that you could look at about what data. So in our policy, for example, drug arrests out, gang membership out, calls for service in. You could look at blight. And so you have to look at what data you're actually going to count so that you then can think about the interventions, and finally auditing on the back end, that there be constant reporting so we can see, for example, one of the things we call for is let us see the geographic distribution of what happens, the demographics of the communities where police go after this tool is used, and try to get a sense of whether we're seeing bias sneaking in that we can't even catch.
As you pass the mic, and Barry, you might want to answer, David, you as well. Do you feel a growing sense of awareness within the law enforcement community of the concerns around these kind of tools, and are the police starting to police their own use of this in some ways?
So, what I bet David hears this all the time too, is that what the police say, we just had a convening about cost-benefit analysis, and plenty of police said this, which is that the vendors walk in and say, here's this cool thing you should buy, and they, and the jurisdiction down the street's got one, so you definitely want to have one too, and they do, instead of asking, what's the problem we're trying to solve, and is this going to help solve that problem, or is it going to create other problems? I think that we are actually so the moment of hope is that policing agencies understand that they have limited budgets, there's more technology being thrown at them that they can possibly use or acquire, I'm sure they could use it, and they have to make choices. And so that's a moment, I think, where there's an opening to education. And they're also, I'll shout out like the ACLU's got its CCOPS model of, which is a surveillance statute that is, to get the community to approve when surveillance technologies are adopted. So there's progress being made, but I still think it's like the tiny tip of a very large iceberg.
And just to keep on saying this, my really high-level objection to this stuff is about violence prevention work. There are other places where there are other dynamics, but I literally can't think of a way that this can be useful given the state of the art in preventing serious violence.
I want to go back to the statement about objectives. And one of the objectives should be to reduce and ultimately eliminate racial disparities in the criminal justice system, period. We can make this happen. We have to make it happen. If you talk to people who are not part of the criminal justice system and dealing with these numbers and statistics every day, and you tell them that people of certain communities, people of color, African American, Latino communities, individuals are treated differently unnecessarily by the criminal justice system, they will say, how can you call that a justice system? So, when we talk about goals and objectives, one of those goals and objectives has to be at the outset that we will figure out a way to use the data to help us reduce, eliminate, and ultimately eliminate racial disparities in the system. That is also one of the reasons why community is so important. At the end of the day, the data is the starting point for what gets crunched in the numbers, but a lot of decisions are made ultimately about risk and need that are based on community norms. And that needs to come from the community to say what we want the norms to be. And the community needs to be there to say, we want a criminal justice system that is racially equitable. And so it is critical not only to have counsel, but to have community. Not only in terms of, at the outset, when you're considering whether to use the tool or not, how to use the tool, and what that looks like.
All right, so we saved the best question for last, I think, and certainly the most provocative one, and I want to just, it's late in the afternoon, so I'll ask it in a pretty provocative way just to get us moving here a little bit. So if not risk assessments, then what? Spent a lot of time in courtrooms over the year, whether it's pretrial or otherwise. A provocative way to say this is that every decision maker's got an algorithm in his or her head, and you have no idea what that algorithm is. You have no idea what factors they're considering. You have no idea how they're weighting those factors. You have no idea whether you're weighting them differently than Barry would. It's a car break-in. Your car just got broken into. You're pissed off about car break-ins, so you ding the guy who's before you the next day. Your car didn't get broken into. You haven't heard about that lately. Not a big deal. How do you think about effectively guiding discretion and creating some equity if you have no sort of common basis that is put out there that says, how does this community value and weight these types of offenses in that context? So stick with pretrial.
The answer is in this room. We're going to get there. We can just let people go, you know? Like, we can let the vast majority of people go. But I think what you're truly talking about is, how do we change the culture and the behavior of judges who have been doing this for an extraordinarily long time? So I think that there are a lot of opportunities right now with some of the processes that are happening around the country. With the MacArthur Safety and Justice Challenge, we have dozens of jurisdictions going through these changes, mostly through partnerships where people are working together in new ways, including the community, and I mean people impacted both personally by harm, as well as people impacted by mass incarceration, not as consultative bodies in these conversations, but frankly, the customers, the power in these conversations, right? Because really, every bit of these institutions is funded almost exclusively by our taxpayer dollars, and they're meant to provide a level of safety for our communities that we should define. And I just want to mark that I don't actually think I live in the happy, pretty world when I say that. I think I live in the science world. I think that I live in the world where the implementation of algorithms of this nature, whether they're being put into Medicaid decisions, robbing people with MS of long-term care, or whether they're taking away children for black mothers in Chicago, or whether they are sending people, whether they are currently in the city of New York. I was like Rachel Ferran of the Brooklyn Community Bail Fund told me, and she said on the launch call that we had for our statement of concern on risk assessment, that something like over 80% of the people that they've bailed out have been given a high risk score for flight, for not showing back up for court, and that's why they were locked up. You can only lock people up for risk for not showing up for court in the city of New York. But of those people that they bailed out, when they did a random sampling of them, well over 90% of them came back for every single court date. And they did it with simple supports, with labor, but with simple supports. Prove to me that the algorithm in the head of the judge is worse or better or whatever than the algorithm that we're putting on paper that undeniably enshrines this extraordinary evil racial bias, and fine. But we're not seeing that evidence. What we really need to be doing is answering the direct question of what is the purpose of jail? And what is the purpose of prison? And if it truly doesn't keep us safe, and if letting the vast majority of people go helps us make our communities richer and more whole for the next generation, then we don't need a computer algorithm to tell us that.
So my comments are going to be premised on an assumption that we've already agreed that we should use risk assessments to figure out how to release people as a starting point, and that it assumes that, you know, in any given community that there's been a conversation and agreement about certain categories of individuals that, that we're going to honor the presumption of innocence, that we're going to seriously take into consideration presumption of release, and that we have agreement about vast numbers of people who just should not be detained pretrial. So then we're dealing with a smaller group, and then I'll answer the question in that context. So focus on what works. What works to, in different ways people are saying that, what works to get people to appear for their court dates. I will give a different example. In Contra Costa, the public defender and law enforcement got together to create for a program, and created a program to give early notification to people. The police give every person who's in their misdemeanor citation or whatever the public defender's card, a yellow card that tells them, call the public defenders. Public defenders aggressively follow up with folks. Their appearance rates have improved astronomically. So it's about using data, but about using data differently, and where you start as opposed to where you, someplace other than risk assessments that can make a difference. Start with what will get people to court, what will make them successful in terms of not reoffending, and deal with the data information about that. Judges want to know what works. When you testify and you talk to people in the community, they want to know what works, and often I will say that they have as good of an idea about that as the science, if not better. But I think that's the starting point. Once you narrow the field to those individuals where you really should be having a conversation or need to be having this conversation, focus on the research about what works to achieve the goals that we're trying to achieve in the system.
So I'm going to fight the hypothetical because I think technology is just here to stay, and prediction is here to stay, and I don't think we're going to make it go away. But I'm going to offer a different kind of solution. So, and this moves maybe into controversy in a different area. But so I sit on an artificial intelligence ethics board that Axon, formerly Taser, set up, and a lot of folks in the civil rights community decided not to sit on that board when invited, and I agonized about sitting on that board. And I ultimately concluded that it was the right thing to do because we need to understand how the products are made and what's happening, and to try to have a voice at that table. But when I was first approached to do that, I actually had a counteroffer, which I've decided to now put out in public anywhere that I can go, which is that I think that we need some kind of ethical oversight, standard setting for these industries. They're all moving very quickly. The vendors are competing with one another very quickly to develop products that they can sell. They often don't fully understand how their own products are used. The police departments that are buying them may not fully understand what they're doing. And so I think there's a need to bring together the civil liberties communities and the racial justice communities and the public safety communities and think about what we think is a sane world, and this is true for both the pretrial risk assessments and frankly for all of this technology, what's in and what's out in a way that makes the use of these products permissible and struggling for words, and acceptable to all of us. And to say, you've created this product and it's doing whatever, but it's not, just like we do in the environmental area, it's got, and I understand all the problems with ratings and standard settings and how they get corrupted and whatnot. I'm not naive about any of that, but I think it's better to try to do that, to say what's acceptable about what's in and out, rather than just letting, 1,000 flowers bloom and letting the police departments or any other entity in government purchase whatever they want and use it in whatever way they do.
I just want to add to that is that in many instances, some of these tools develop outside of the judicial context, and they really perhaps weren't even meant or anticipated that they would be used in that way. But once you bring in the justice system, once you bring in courts, then the level of responsibility for oversight and the equation between transparency and proprietary secrets changes. You're talking about somebody's liberty. It's a very different conversation than, keeping trade secrets so that company A can, make more money than company B. And so recognizing that, I couldn't agree more about the need for that oversight and realizing that, we have a particularly high standard and responsibility to the community to do justice.
So let me wrap this up, because I have been way out on one end of this, saying, at least in this one domain, these are just not good tools, and I think never will be. But the conversation we're having and the intent of these devices is to provide insight, right? We want to act with more insight and with better grounding than we otherwise would. And one does not need fancy math or an algorithm to have insight. We have insight all the time into things that are really important and in which people's lives are at stake. Without having algorithms or formal stats or digital tools. So I'm going back to my core focus on the prevention of serious violence. It's not hard to figure out who seriously violent people are. They've done bad things. They've hurt people. And our capacity to predict somebody who has not done that and their likelihood to do that going forward is zero. Our capacity to look out at a community and identify those people who are at high risk to themselves and others in that community is very high because they're hurting themselves and others. They self-identify. It's not prediction, it's behavior. And the reason that Andy Papachristos can go to any city and create now very quickly a network of the very highest risk people is because if you look at people who have been shot and killed or shot and survived, and then look at people that ordinary, at least in this case criminal justice data, identify as having behavioral connections to those people, you get a network of people that will be at sometimes 500 times the risk of being hurt of other people that they live right next to. That's not prediction, that's not an algorithm, that's just observation. You need to focus to do effective work, but there are all kinds of ways to focus. And this is not unusual. The example that I finally came up with, because it turns out to be very hard to get people to see this. We could have a fancy algorithm that predicts the risk of auto accidents in the general driving public. And it wouldn't be very good, I predict, but we could do it. We just know for a fact that young people who've just started driving are at very high risk. That's a fact, it's not a prediction. It's an observation over time, and we all know it's true. It therefore makes sense to give special attention in various ways to young people who have just started driving, and we do that all the time. But we carry with that the knowledge that the fact that they are observably at high risk does not mean that any single one of them will ever have a crash. It certainly doesn't mean that all of them will have a crash. And we don't have any capacity to predict which ones in that high-risk population will have a crash. Everything that's happened in violence prevention over the last 20 years as a real science of violence prevention has emerged, has started with the fact that it's actually extremely easy to predict the groups and networks that are at high risk for at least urban violence. And then if we engage with them in some now fairly well-developed ways, which very heavily focuses on keeping them safe as well as surveillance and enforcement, then we can make a big difference in violence. Swift, Certain, Fair has redefined probation by saying to people, here are your terms and conditions. If you violate them, if you show behavior that is contrary to your standards, we'll take further action. I would submit we can send everybody home without bail. And if we have a reasonable expectation that they do something wrong that we really care about, we'll know it and do something. So not just an enormous range of technical violations, but commit a meaningful new crime, hurt somebody. They have then self-identified as not being a good risk for having in the community. Let them tell us. And whatever harm will come out of not keeping them all locked up, and everybody's been saying this, will be very small relative to the harm that we're doing right now with our current practices. So insight's actually pretty easy, and we should act on it. This is a lot simpler, I think, than we think it is.
Great, thank you. All right, let's get to questions. Joanna?
Hi, I'm Joanna Weil with the Behavioral Insights team and also the University of California, Santa Cruz. So we touched on both risk assessment for police and pretrial, but we didn't really touch on it for post-release supervision or maybe supervision more broadly. So I was wondering if there were any thoughts on that. Is that an area of as much concern or maybe less concern, different concerns?
It is an area of great and abiding concern. So in the city of Philadelphia, for example, there is a tool that was built by a data scientist named Dr. Richard Burke. He's a criminologist at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also in the process of building a tool for Philadelphia. And the tool that he built that is still in use by our probation and parole department it's the kind of tool that it's a black box because it has hundreds of different factors and it takes a different path through the data for every individual person, kind of like a choose your own adventure, depending who you are. And when it was studied by a study funded by the Bureau of Justice Statistics in the mid-2000s, it found that of the hundreds of different factors that were weighed in the tool, about 42 of them were found to be predictive, and I could be a little wrong on that number. The highest ranked one was age, and the second highest ranked one was zip code. And Philadelphia is the fourth most segregated city in the United States. I believe now that zip code is out of the tool, but this tool is used every day to make assignments for probation and parole in the city of Philadelphia, a city that has 44,000, 3% of the city, 44,000 people on city supervision. And we have a state where probation and parole tails are something like the third longest in the United States. And so when you have a tool like that, making decisions about the gravity, weight, and length of a probation decision, and those violations of probation and parole are the biggest driver of incarceration in our jails up on State Road. 58% of the people in them are not there just on a bail or on a conviction that they're serving. They're there on a technical or new arrest violation of a pre-existing probation or parole sentence. So it's a massive, massive driver of reincarceration, I think, of the same gravity as bail. And it's something we're focusing on heavily in Philadelphia.
Thank you. Hey, my name is Sean Sassman. I wanted to say a couple of things and just kind of ask a question of the panel. I really appreciate some of the bold, I think, sort of statements and approaches and the rethinking of not just where risk and needs or risk assessments might live, but much more the origination of sort of our approach to how we deal with human beings. And I wanted to take two comments and sort of put them together. I really liked your comment, young man in the beard, about the idea to get more insight, and we have more insight, and so why don't we get that insight? And the second is that if we use the data we have available to us now in the policing practices, et cetera, that we just imbue or infuse structural racism already into the data. So that with your artificial intelligence comment, why not have technology help us get insights from the individuals along their journey, meaning in treatment, maybe making mistakes, maybe not making mistakes, those who do somehow find their way into the system through crime and or through addiction and or through homelessness, and then somehow find out how to get the assessment information or insights directly from them and go around entirely, 100 years of compiled data around policing and other practices, and then train your AI engine or your AI sort of concepts on thousands of data points coming in as insight from the individuals to maybe alert, suggest, or nudge them back with, these are some things that might be ahead in your future, here might be some ways to avoid those positively, and or there might be some risks. I don't know, just a thought. Thank you.
So it's a good thought, and there are more and more people who are starting to try to want to get more data, put the data together in ways that we can gain insight and gain knowledge. I'll shout out my colleague Ann Milgram, who's working among other places in Camden trying to put together health outcomes data and policing data to reach an, perhaps obvious point, sort of duh once you think about it, but that a lot of the places that the police get called are also the places that are having health crises of different sorts, and to try to intervene in a way other than with force and law just to solve problems. It's a two-edged sword, as we like to say in law, forgive me, and so it's useful to at least be aware of it, and I think the best way I can think of awareness of it is when you think about going to visit a doctor and you have to fill out that unbelievably annoying thing on paper with all of your information, and you do it from doctor to doctor, and you think, oh my God, like, can't they just get this in the computer and then they just know it when I walk in the room? And at the same time, I'm at NYU, and when you go see a doctor there, they, you put your palm down and it does know everything about you, and that's scary too. And so there's danger in putting all of that data together, and I worry on both sides. I think there's a need to gain insight from information that we have, and we're not doing a good job of doing it. But at the same time, and this is not my domain, but folks that worry about privacy and systems to protect privacy have to figure out a way to know that that data is going to be secure, and that's a tough challenge.
Afternoon, Brandon Johnson. One of the things that I'm dealing with and we're working hard on in the city of Birmingham is dealing with it from a policing standpoint. Our police chief is from Los Angeles, and there have been some studies about all of the data collected in Los Angeles and what that means for civil liberties. And even, this past Supreme Court session, I believe it's Carpenter versus U.S., they said something about, maybe we shouldn't be allowing all of these cell phone records to be used in tracking people in policing. You were talking about it in a pretrial sense. In an investigative sense, we're worried about parallel construction, right? Where we're creating cases on people without warrants and then using the data that we illegally obtain to go establish probable cause. How is that different than using these algorithms in particularly a parole setting or a pretrial setting? Like, you're using data to make the case against a person before any trial or anything like that has happened. So how is that a different constitutional issue than parallel construction to get warrants?
Well, I'm not going to do it because I can't, but I will just say, ironically or sardonically, we're not doing very well in the investigative sense with that stuff. I mean, people look at a decision like Carpenter that says that the police need warrants to get cell site tracking information over a long period of time, but by and large, the courts are terrible at regulating all this, which is why we focus on front-end accountability, because the courts have not been our friend. And so even in the parallel construction, area where law enforcement has some information they shouldn't have, and then use that to work backward to find a legitimate way to go after somebody. The courts don't do much to clamp down on it.
So I would love to learn more about some of the background from your question. I'd also love to connect you with some folks in Los Angeles who were directly involved in pushing back against the sort of massive surveillance net. There's some wonderful folks, Hamid Khan among them, out there in LA, and Curb. But I think that, so when I talk with people, and I've talked with people about technology and their power over technology for my entire adult life, when I started talking with people about risk assessment and saying what it was and how it worked, especially people in Philadelphia, which is it's the poorest big city in the United States. It's a majority people of color city. They were like, oh, hell no, of course something like that trained on data on people who on their face look like me or come from my family or come from my community would be wrong about me and wrong about everyone that those tools were judging. And when we were resisting the state sentencing tool, people who had served many years on the inside came to these hearings and said, this is my name, I have a master's degree. I run my own nonprofit organization. I have these contracts doing reentry with the city. I have a father. I'm a musician, I'm a poet. And this tool would have said that I was dangerous and never let me see the light of day, right? And so what we're finding is that human beings are very aware that they don't want a computer to determine their freedom. It's called a weapon of math destruction, according to Cathy O'Neill, who wrote a great popular book with that name. When the tool is selling you, like I go onto Facebook more than I'd like to admit. Quite a lot, I will say. A mother of 2 little kids. You know, Facebook thinks that I want 2 things. It thinks that I want one of those bicycles where you can put your kids in a basket in the front and go to the farmer's market, and I'll be real with you, I absolutely want one of those bicycles. They're about $1,000 though, so it's not gonna happen. It also thinks I want to rent a business wardrobe. I do not want to rent a business wardrobe. That's a low stakes decision, right? But it's a high stakes decision when it comes to whether or not the cops are knocking on your door thinking you're bad. Or building a case against you in case you do something. It's a high stakes decision when it comes to whether or not you get to go home. But I don't want to overthink this too. I think that the whole reason we're relying on tools of this nature is because there's issues of resources, because we're trying to influence and control the behavior of judges, because the intent of this is to reduce the impact of this net. We're just now starting to see that the intent and the impact are extraordinarily different. And it goes back to what we started with, which is power, right? When the people building tools of these nature, profiting off of tools of these nature, are not the people most judged by these tools. Whether or not they intend to pick things that they call objective or scientific, or build a tool that is framed in that way, whether or not they do that. There's going to be disparate impact on communities of color, there's going to be disparate impact on poor people, on queer people, on immigrant people. And I would like to say that, like, for me, I really think that any decision that a computer makes about someone and says that they're scary and they lose their freedom because they're black, one person for them that happening to is too many. And so I'm not sure if that answers your question, but the sort of underpinning underneath it, I think, spans this entire issue.
Time for one more question. There.
Hi, my name is Monica Novoa. I'm with Just Leadership USA. I have more of a comment. Looking at how a lot of people on the ground in the campaigns that we're a part of, in Philadelphia, in Los Angeles, in Milwaukee, just kind of across the country, are looking at this tool. One of the things that we've talked a lot about is just the idea of dangerousness and how that shapes the conversation that we're just able to have, right? And as a comms director, I pay a lot of attention to this. So, just ascribing dangerousness just pathologizes blackness and black and brown human beings. So this is why, Adam, you were able to make that joke when we walked in to your white co-panelist, right? Like that wouldn't work if he was a black man. But I have a hard time believing that an obsession with people as dangerousness, with people who, under the most dehumanizing conditions, have taken part in violent events or behavior, or that have healing and rehabilitating to do, will ultimately be productive. We're just kind of questioning why that's the focus. So we really look forward to needs assessments and to organizers who are doing that work. So that's my comment.
Any responses?
Yeah,
Absolutely. I alluded to the use of language in this area earlier. We need to throw it out and start all over, and focus on, what can the success rate for individuals? What can we do to help them be successful, instead of the opposite of that, for example. And some of us are really thinking about that and talking about that, and it's very important. So absolutely.
We can slip in one more. Diane?
Sorry, the question just came up when she was saying her comment. It's actually for you. So you you made a comment about the article, I think it was, and then how it starts off as vulnerability, and then it gets into like danger. It just popped up when she was talking about that. I wonder if you could talk more a little bit about vulnerability, and maybe basically, if the conversation can change, instead of talking about risks and danger, talking about like vulnerability, and if that like helps.
I hope it helps. So I had the same thought while you were talking, which is that, again, in this domain of serious, mostly urban violence, the very best analytic tools are organized beginning with people who have been killed and who have usually suffered non-fatal gunshot wounds, and are then able to provide, using pretty simple techniques, very small networks of people who are at extraordinary risk. And you remembered the point I made, which is, and this is to everything we've been talking about here, that in a culture that is obsessed with dangerousness, those framings and understandings of risk invariably turn into framings and discussion and action around dangerousness. And yes, of course, these are, when Andy does his work in Chicago, these are networks that are found in the poorest black and brown communities, and that kicks in everything that you've just said and everything that we all know happens. The network analysis cannot say other things that everybody who does this work knows, which is those are people who've been hurt. They're people who've been traumatized. They live in communities that suffer from very high levels of collective trauma over victimization that has happened. You talk to any one of those guys who is at high risk and ask him why he's carrying a gun, and his answer will be, because that guy over there is trying to kill me. And we are not keeping him safe, and so he is trying to keep himself safe. And on and on and on and on. I'll note, so I keep talking about one kind of violence, I'll note, because this is important, that the risk assessment that is most widely used for intimate partner violence, which is another place that risk assessments have become very common, does not take any action or lead to any action with respect to the person that woman usually is at risk from. The risk assessment says exclusively, let's make sure she knows that she has access to more services. It does nothing direct to protect her from a known threat, because if she's at high risk from somebody, she knows what his name is. And we don't do anything about that situation in the normal way that we use those instruments. So one of the big movements within violence prevention is to shift the focus, and again, from dangerousness and offending to risk and victimization and trauma and the way those things play out. Because in practice, what one finds is if the image of a dangerous offender in these settings is of a super predator and that sort of thing, those people exist, but there are hardly any of them. Almost everybody who's at high risk for that kind of violent victimization has been traumatized, has been hurt, has lost friends, has lost family, is living a life of chaos, and their situation of dangerousness is situational. It is not about them and their character, which is again why these instruments that try to look at individual level factors and make these predictions are just so fundamentally off base. And if we look back at the 20 years of emerging work on violence prevention, the biggest victory so far has, aside from coming up with stuff that's effective on the ground, is getting the idea out there that almost nobody in dangerous neighborhoods is dangerous. Almost everybody in the community is not dangerous. The next big one, and I think we're making headway on this, is, and of those people, we should think of them first in terms of their risk and vulnerability and victimization and trauma, and not as dangerous others. And we're getting somewhere on that.
I just want to respond briefly to what David said in a sort of a structural way. Like, really what we're talking about here is invest, divest, right? What we're talking about is that if we're using, which is something that's been pushed in the policy platform by the Movement for Black Lives and is something that many different communities are pushing for when they talk about structural change, if we're able to get our jail populations down, or the size of our police force down to a size when we can take those extraordinarily precious public resources and put them into communities directly into communities, I would add. I would like some of the best programs that we know about and that we work with in Philadelphia aren't ones necessarily that come from the system itself, although there's many incredible and well-intentioned people in the system itself, but come instead from communities. When we find that happening, we're able to provide the basic needs and supports and ability for self-determination that help people not be touched by violence or the system in the first place. And so there's a lot of efforts happening now. Monica was talking about organizers focusing on needs assessment. That's a big part of that conversation. There's a live group of people working now on needs assessment that relates to this. And so stay tuned.
Great. Listen, I want to thank you all for hanging in there for a long day today. Appreciate your hanging around, and hopefully we went over because of the rich discussion that shed a lot more light than heat on a really tough subject and conversation. So please, a hand for our panel.